you're looking for good, clean fun, you better stay home.
Fuck you, motherfucker!
Some form of rock, whatever, variant we are, but we're not rock and roll, and we're not good-timey rock and roll, If someone gets a feeling of elation from our music, it's from something else, from inner, something inner, an inner spirit, or, you know what I mean? We are not mainstream, and we are not alternative, so we're disliked by both sides. But what it says to me is that we're not in any clique.
As you can probably tell by now, Glenn Danzig is a very important artist in my life. Now, it doesn't mean I'm above telling a joke at the guy's expense, but his work means a lot to me. He's one of the musicians who turned me into the weirdo I am today. In fact, in my teenage years when I had black hair, I was frequently told I looked like either him or Peter Steele. Hell, I still occasionally get comments like that, which looking back now, I'm not sure if that's a compliment or not. I'll have you guys know I am not short. His body of work is one that's incredibly hard to outmatch with how eclectic and consistent it is. Up until a point.
Foreshadowing is a literary device
and Danzig was the final form. After slaving away in the punk underground for about a decade, Danzig was arguably Glenn at the peak of his powers with by far the best band to support him yet. A metal monolith. This is the Danzig Retrospective. Every time I talk about Glenn's work in these intros, it gets harder and harder as I've already talked about all the history at length in the retrospectives for the Misfits and Samhain. But for those unfamiliar, I'll touch on it. But if you want more information, by all means check out those other retrospectives, if you have yet to do so. In the late 70s, Glenn Anzalone, later renamed Glenn Danzig, formed a punk band called the Misfits. They had an interest in all things macabre and melodic, and in their short 6-year career, they left a legacy of brutality in their wake. In 1983, he broke up the Misfits to form Samhain, with Eerie Von as bassist along with a handful of other musicians. They were around for even less time, 5 years, releasing records that ran the gamut from punk, death rock, and goth. In 1986, the already legendary producer / record executive Rick Rubin saw Samhain at the Ritz at the suggestion of the guys from Metallica, and liked Glenn a whole lot, but not so much the rest of the band. He wanted to dump them and form a supergroup with Glenn as the frontman. He got Glenn to dump drummer London May and guitarist Pete Damian Marshall, but Eerie stayed. He says in his book, Miseria Obscura, "I'm sure Rick figured out I'd be gone soon enough anyway. By this point, I wasn't scared of losing my spot on bass. After all, Glenn and I formed this band, and it was he and I versus the world." It's a bit of a shame that Samhain ended somewhat prematurely because they were really starting to hit their stride by the time November Coming Fire came out. But you could still see the building blocks of what Danzig would become.
November coming fire, sour grill, and then it'll come down, sour grill.
After some auditions, John Christ joined on lead guitar, a total metalhead all about Maiden, Sabbath, Priest, you name it. He could wail and conjure up riffs like nobody's business. Seriously, John Christ is one of the unsung guitar heroes of his era. And despite making a good impression on everybody else, Glenn thought he was too metal and he was still a punk at heart. But eventually, he saw the light. Probably after John proved his loyalty by sending answering machine messages of him playing guitar over and over again.
He wouldn't call me back. So I started putting the telephone in front of my Marshall stack in my bedroom and playing stuff like...
For drums, it was between either Filthy Phil of Motorhead fame or Chuck Biscuits, a god in the hardcore punk scene by that point. According to Eerie's book, Rick Rubin called Chuck and said, "This is Rick Rubin. I'm sitting here with Glenn Danzig, who's putting together a new band. what would it take for you to join? To which Chuck responded, a plane ticket. And without even an audition, the final piece of the original Danzig band was found. And Chuck is one of my all-time favorite drummers. He had this tiny kit, but the sound he got was huge, groovy, and expansive. A love child of rat scabies from the Damned, John Bonham, Bill Ward, Stuart Copeland, and Animal from the Muppets. Painfully underrated. The man was a beast.
When you watched him play, it was just sweat and sawdust flying off the kit. Every snare drum hit, he did a rim shot. So he was hitting the stick on the rim of the snare at the same time he's hitting the head.
In 1987, the band Sans Aria recorded a song for the film Less Than Zero, which is amazing in my opinion and definitely worth a listen. And Rick convinced Glenn to change the name from Samhain to Danzig, so never have to worry about, people leaving or changing the name ever again. When Glenn and Rick told the rest of the band that the name was changing to Glenn's last name, Aria said, without hesitation, "Oh, just like Bon Jovi."
Yeah, I believe in God. I don't believe in God as some old guy with a beard or anything like that, but as a power, yeah. If you believe in God, you believe in Satan. It doesn't necessarily mean you worship Satan. Satan's probably one of the most misunderstood characters in the Bible or in Christian religion. God's most beloved angel. His original right-hand man. Well, I haven't really got that much flack yet, but, if they want to fight, it's about me. Probably know more about organized religion than they do. Probably know more about their histories and what they really should be all about than they do. So, if they want to fight, come on.
What else can you say about the debut Danzig record other than classic? It almost defies analysis. This is Glenn in his purest form. Unlike Samhain, there's no reverbed out production, no spooky synths, and no real anything besides the band themselves. Rick Rubin produced this record, and he lived by bands like AC/DC, and this record has a similar sound. Very sparse and very dry. The band hated this at the time, and I could see why, but for me it totally works. There's a genius to stripping things down in the right way and letting the songs and performances speak for themselves. And when you have a band this good, why hide behind production? Though Glenn is still Glenn. He didn't change himself that much. In fact, when you look at the lyrics, he barely changed at all. Still singing about spirituality and everything blasphemous. She Rides may be about exactly what you think it's about, but it's not just some motley crew, bump and grind, fuck me, suck me type thing. The lyrics refer to Lilith from Jewish mythology, Adam's first wife, made from the same clay and at the same time as he was, while Eve was made from his rib later. She refused to be subservient to Adam and either left or was banished from Eden. Accounts vary as to what happened later to her, one being that she became a mistress of all things darkness. She rides the night, it says in the lyrics. The cymbal groove and arrangement adds to the lyrics because it still has some really creepy riffs and sparse backing vocals and moans. So is it about sex? Well, no duh, but the occult subtext makes this song far more interesting than anything from Dr. Feelgood.
She will make you scream, she's dead. In a good white rusty ride. In the night of your mind, she rides the night.
But because they couldn't hide behind production, this is the toughest time in the studio any of the guys had ever endured. Before Rick Rubin became infamous for napping on the job, he was relentless. A crap ton of overdubs, double tracks, and playing the songs over and over and over again. He replayed the Am I Demon bass lines so much he could play them in his sleep. And Chuck ran from his kit to the control room over and over again, only for Rick to grill his playing and get him to go back to work. But it paid off. It's a precise piece of classic rock tinged metal. John Christ's influence is immediately apparent with the Iommi influenced riffs, like with the opener, Twist of Cain. They're simple but catchy enough to carry the song on its own. As you can tell by the title, it references Cain and Abel, the former being, according to the Bible, the first murderer. It makes sense why Glenn would be drawn to the story. Despite not being Christian, he's read the Bible and he probably knows more about the good book better than most Christians. Fun fact, Twist of Cain and Possession were both not only demoed for the fourth full-length Samhain album, but were eventually released on the box set version of Final Ascent, and they both also feature backing vocals by one James Hetfield. The classic 70s rock influence is felt on the band's superb cover of The Hunter, originally by Albert King. Am I Demon is incredibly Sabbath-inspired, somewhat aping Children of the Grave. Arguably it's a downright ripoff, but Black Sabbath wrote the playbook, and if you're going to rip somebody off, you may as well rip off the best. Besides, Sabbath, as much as I love them, could never get onto Glenn's level in terms of blasphemy, so you can't act as if they didn't add anything. My favorite track off the record is Soul on Fire, one of my favorite Danzig songs, period. It's one of few cuts on this record to include additional instrumentation with some horns and what sounds like a slide banjo or something. I have no idea what that instrument is or if it's backing vocals, but it sounds killer. And the lyrics for the song must be older because it references the Samhain or Samhain of Glenn's soul, but it's a cool way to use the imagery of the Celtic celebration, relating it to one's own self. And the Samhain of your soul could mean you're close to the spiritual world and the occult, but it could also be analogous to just the human condition. And of course, Mother, the Danzig song. I remember first hearing this song in Guitar Hero and not really getting it as a youngin'. I didn't really get it until I got into the Misfits and the rest of Glenn's output when I was like 13, 14. By then, the power and majesty of the track sunk in. It's a perfect hard rock metal song, whatever you want to call it. It's about defiance and being yourself, despite what people might try and say or do. It was written as a response to the PMRC and their attempt at censoring many acts in the rock and metal world. It's a song directed pretty much squarely at Tipper Gore's head, and they reacted by almost immediately throwing a parental advisory sticker, or a Tipper sticker as some called it, onto the album, despite there being no curse words or anything like that to be found. Glenn said recently, "I was saying stuff they were offended by, questioning religion and questioning government. That's a no-no. I especially love the lyric, 'Not about to see your light.' You know how high and mighty religious types will go on and on about how they've seen the lights. Do me a favor and get lost. If this light makes me anything like you, I don't want any part of it." According to John Christ, the original song was more like, a Misfits punk rock type of thing, but he and Rick Rubin came in and made it more dynamic with how he played said chords, made it bluesier with more of a crescendo. Hell, even that iconic drum fill from Chuck is actually from Rick Rubin.
That drum fill was Rick Rubin. That was Rick's drum fill. Chuck didn't come up with that. Rick came up with that. Chuck duplicated it.
While Glenn may be the only songwriter, he's not the only person who made that song what it is. The entire band, along with Rick, are a big part of that iconic Danzig sound, whether Glenn likes to admit it or not. And that's a debut Danzig record. Just classic metal for all to hear. But it didn't exactly set the world on fire, despite setting my soul on fire. Hell, Mother wouldn't actually become a hit until 5 years later, but we'll get there, don't worry. And the band themselves didn't like the bone dry production at all, though Sean has since come around to it in recent years. But regardless, the band had an all-time classic as their debut record, so how do you top that?
Basically, my rules are there are no rules. Whatever you want to do is great as long as you stay within the framework you set, and that your fans, also are used to, you know what I mean? That whole thing. I think if you want to explore all these areas, it's all right to do so as long as you keep it hard and, not soft. There is a very tense blues song on the new record. It's very tense. It's not like a sit-down happy blues song. I don't write sit-down happy blues songs even when I do.
If the debut Danzig record was Glenn and Company going back to the roots with a more classic 70s rock type sound, then Danzig II, Lucifuge, is the band going back to the roots of rock itself, this record is very influenced by the blues. And when you think about the history of blues, not counting the first guy to ever play a tritone, it was the original devil's music. You could definitely see the allure for someone like Glenn to get into this kind of stuff. It's even in the name of the record. Lucifuge is a Latin phrase, like Onitium was for his former band, and it means to flee the light. The band in general are just a tighter unit. They had time to bond and really gel as a band while on tour for the first record. The chemistry is amazing, the blues influence can be heard in a lot of ways, but it's maybe never more blatant than on Killer Wolf. It's got that classic blues creep in the riffs, and what I'm pretty sure is diminished chords ringing out in the verse. It evokes a similar uneasy feeling when you listen to old blues songs written by guys who supposedly sold their souls for their musical gifts. Glenn said of the song, "My version of an old blues song about a guy who's around the door of every girl in town. An old bragging blues tune." Snakes of Christ is about the teachings of Christ and how they've been perverted by the Catholics and Baptists, and that worshiping this version of Jesus Christ is maybe as bad as worshiping Satan. And when you see the hate some Christians spew out in the name of their God, it makes a lot of sense. Ain't no hate like Christian love, am I right? It has this amazing and catchy main riff that Glenn has said is reminiscent of Sex Type Thing by SDP. While kinda true, the Danzig song is also reminiscent of Pink Floyd's Lucifer Sam. Everyone rips off everyone, and speaking of ripping people off, maybe the best track off this record is Her Black Wings, and its main riff kinda apes Zero the Hero by Sabbath. Aria was asked about it, and he just said, "Dude, it's all Black Sabbath." And not for nothing, but goddamn, what a monster of a track. Glenn describes writing it as laborious and tedious, and you can see why. There's a lot of moving parts and atmosphere. The arrangements aren't as stripped down as they were in the debut. Glenn said it's lyrically about, and I quote, "a woman to the 10th power." A little vague, but I think he means a sort of deified version of a woman. Some sort of abstraction of a female that appeals to Glenn. Tired of Being Alive is one of the more blunt songs that Glenn ever wrote, but goddamn, Suicidal Ideation has never been more pleasing to the ears. Surprisingly enough, it's not a depressive woe is me type song. It's less of wanting to die and just being tired of the persecution for being the way he is, in a way that's even more sad. Speaking of sad subject matter, Blood and Tears, the ballad off the record, is absolutely mesmerizing. It's very old school rock and roll in its structure and performance. Very Richie Valens, very Roy Orbison, very Elvis. The lyrics aren't even from Glenn's point of view, instead telling the story of a girl's failed relationship and her torments because of its breakdown. Probably the only track of this record to not feature anything from the dark side of life. But the grounded lyrics work with Glenn's empathetic and powerful performance. This may not be one of Glenn's belters, but I'll be damned if it isn't one of his best. And that's Danzig II. Fucking classic record. Masterpiece. It's everything the debut is, but just a little bit more. More laid production, more blasphemous lyrics, and more Danzig in general. This record is more of a classic Danzig spirit and vibe, in my opinion. So let's see if they can continue this momentum.
I think the bands in the 60s that may have done maybe pop records, it really wasn't a pop market then. It was just different styles of bands, and they genuinely, liked that style of music they were doing. It wasn't for a money profit thing, and I think radio, especially in America, was more open to different stuff than it is now. A lot of people just do things to make money and get a quick buck and get out. I hate that stuff. To me, that's not music.
There's the packaging side, the merchandising side that you find to be...
No, the insincerity. That's what I hate.
How do you retain yours?
By not playing that game.
Danzig III, How the Gods Kill, is once again the band finding themselves reaching a new level. It's a perfect storm of bluesy, doomy riffs, drum fills that are up there with the best of Keith Moon, and Glenn's unmatchable bellow. They're really starting to hit their stride, and there's a good argument to be made for this being the quintessential Danzig album. It's not my favorites, I honestly like Lucifuge more, but you can't deny what Glenn and company accomplished on this record. Eerie Vaughn said that while Rick Rubin fronted the cash for the album, he wasn't in the studio very often, if at all, so Glenn is producing this thing himself, but unlike on later records where his production is a bit more of a hindrance than a benefit, to put it lightly, he had a lot of great engineers to work with and the rest of the band to keep him in check. It wasn't Glenn doing everything. John spent a lot of time getting the right guitar tones for each track, he spent a lot of time in the arrangements as well, and he had a decent amount of freedom to do what he wanted. Dirty Black Summer was the lead single, and it's a good example of what John Christ was able to do. There's a lot of cool and interesting guitar work. The solo is jaw-dropping, that riff is so catchy and bouncy, and I love what Chuck is doing with the ride cymbal especially. It's a catchy song, but the hooks are in the instrumentals less than the vocals themselves, as great as Glenn's vocals are.
And nothing like an August night. Fetching your loving. I got a dirty black summer. Yeah, my dirty black summer. Yeah, give me black summer.
The structures of these songs have never been more impressive. Godless is the opener and it's our longest track yet. Almost 7 minutes with so many rises and falls, tempo changes, and Erie's even doing some cool stuff in the bass here. Pretty good for a guy who calls himself mediocre at his own instruments. Then again, when compared to people like Chuck, John, and Glenn, who are such masters at their craft, I think just about everyone would look mediocre in comparison. The title track is 6 minutes and has this great crescendo all throughout with a drop-dead amazing vocal from Glenn, and maybe the best riff in all of Glenn's discography. It's so simple but so punishing. Heart of the Devil starts off a cappella before going into a demented rocker that is steeped in the blues. And fun fact, apparently Willie Dixon was supposed to guest on the song before he died. There's another ballad on this record, maybe the most low-key ballad he ever recorded. There's no big guitars, the drums are very subtle, and there's this amazing spooky synth in the background that just gives me shivers. And Glenn's performance is pained, you feel his anguish in every note. It's a song about lost love, or a love that can never flourish. The name of the track, Sistinus, comes from the Sistine Chapel paintings by Michelangelo, and the centerpiece of it is Adam and God reaching for each other, but their hands never meet, like two lovers who just couldn't make it work.
What's my soul? Deep inside, oh, and it's so black and cold, deep inside.
Unfortunately, the only real flaw of this record is that Glenn's voice is starting to deteriorate. It's by no means awful, there's still some amazing vocals to be found around this time, but the cracks are definitely starting to show. I know I'm not the first to bring this up, but the chorus of Bodies is a tad painful. I can't say I'm a huge fan of the Muppet impersonation Glenn's added to his repertoire, but it's fine, at least for now. We'll come back to this in a few records. The closing track, When the Dying Calls, has a swirling riff and the little flourishes of guitar all throughout are great. It's tracks like this where John really got to leave his stamp on Danzig, totally changing the vibe of the song by just adding some overdubbed notes here or there. I'd like to see Tommy Victor do something like this on the next Danzig record, that's for sure. As if Glenn would ever let him. There's even this great 5-second pause like they did on Macabre from Initium.
And if I lose, I don't mind. That's where the die.
This band was so ridiculously in sync. Add that with the lyrics about the call of the void, and you have a closer for the ages.
If I'm way in the dark of the world, if I love, I don't mind. Where the dying go, where the dying go.
And that was How the Gods Killed. Maybe the definitive Danzig record. Again, it's not my favorite, but it has all the pieces and is arguably the best place for most new fans to go to if they want to be acquainted with the delectable world of Danzig. But before we go on to the next record, there's some housekeeping. Later in 1992, Glenn released a black Aria. not a Danzig album. It's a solo effort made up of material that Glenn had been writing and recording on and off since 1987, I believe. It's a very dark classical or dungeon synth record. The first 6 tracks take influence from the story of Paradise Lost and Lucifer's exile from heaven, while the final 3 tracks are influenced and named after Celtic mythological creatures, since Glenn was still in Samhain at the time of writing a lot of this stuff. It's a great piece of classical for people who don't normally listen to classical, like myself. It's a great album to listen to in the dark and let its creepy mood and soundscapes tell the story of Satan's fall. Glenn wrote and recorded all the instruments himself, with some female vocals used as another instrument in and of themselves, like in Dirge of Defeat. When that song plays, I honestly find myself feeling sad over fucking Satan. The instrumental is just heartbreaking. The Morrigu and Kun Anun, I believe it's pronounced, were engineered by someone else, so they sound shittier, but they fit the vibes of the songs. It's also a great album to read to. Like, if you're not reading Clive Barker or Lovecraft to an album like this, then you can't possibly be doing it right. I highly recommend the Black Aria, even if you're not usually one for classical music. In 1983, the band released the EP, Thrall-Demonsweatlive, made up of some studio tracks and some live recordings from the Irving Plaza. The live tracks are good, but I'd rather the studio originals, if I'm being completely honest. And the new studio tracks include a great cover of Elvis Presley's Trouble, The Violet Fire is a mid-tempo jam, and Is Coming Down is classic Danzig with bountiful riffs from John and a video that includes Oh no! It's more than a solid release in my opinion. And the live version of Mother on this EP, or Mother 93 rather, is what finally made the song a hit. Even though Mother 93 specifically is barely live, but it got a lot of play on MTV regardless. Danzig was finally a commercial force, the kind that Rick Rubin signed Glenn for. So let's see if they can follow this up. Let's hope they don't self-sabotage and record the most abrasive record yet. That would be awful.
For so many years, people were scared to play our stuff. And all of a sudden they're saying, oh, it's like Much Ado About Nothing. It's like, you know, gee, this isn't that scary. You get some band who just wrote, Satan, Satan, kill, kill, murder, murder, okay? Sure, you know, a kid is gonna love that, okay? But, you know, is there anything there? No, there's nothing there. So what I'd rather do is scratch the surface and delve into it, you know, and, you know, let people decide for themselves.
Just for the record, Glenn Danzig does not, according to his publicist, worship the devil.
If you call our name, rest assured they'll see all these things, but people won't dare. I don't mind before you.
By 1994, Glenn Danzig had finally achieved rock star status. It was something that he had no interest in trying to replicate for Danzig IV. Glenn had many times before went into different musical directions, but Danzig IV is very much a response into how he was being perceived. Eerie theorized that he never wants to become too popular or lose his indie cred, and he didn't want to be an MTV rock god. He wants to be Glenn Danzig, and you can hear it on this record. It's even darker, more atmospheric with loose song structures. I feel this is maybe the most personal version of Glenn we've ever heard on record. It's brash, gloomy, uncommercial, and slightly ugly. This record got a lot of pushback from the fan base they had cultivated throughout the years, and it definitely alienated trendies who hopped on after Mother became a hit. And I'm sorry to disappoint everyone who hates this album, but I will be gushing because this is my favorite Danzig record. I maybe like records like November Coming Fire or Static Age a bit more, but when it comes to the album sporting Glenn's last name, this is second to none in my opinion. It's so twisted, and you have to give the guys respect for doing something so off the rails when they could have easily just made an album full of mothers and more than likely had success. There's no real singles here. The closest we have is Can't Speak. I mean, it's a ballad, but there's no real chorus, and it's covered in a thick industrial gunk with a lot of distortion on the vocals. This song makes use of a lot of backwards guitars and adds to the uneasy tension, capped it off with lyrics about emotional isolation and introspection, and you have a theme song for desperation.
It's hard, I just can't forget it. Go with it cause I'm already dead and gone. Can't try, don't care
Rick Rubin was actually back at the picture for this album. Maybe he had less on his plate this time around, or maybe the band finally started to sell some records and he felt obligated to be there. Who knows, but he's a welcome addition. On the earlier records, Rick kinda held them back and had them record more basically. AC/DC and Black Sabbath were the two obvious examples, and the band weren't too into it, despite the fantastic results in most people's opinions. But here, Rick finally let the guys breathe and be themselves. Chuck nearly always bitched about the sound of his drums in the earlier material. He thought it was too tight and dry, but here his drums are much more airy and they sound looser in comparison to the slightly flat sound he had previous. And Chuck never sounded or played as good as he does here. John was in the trenches experimenting with guitar sounds to make it sound weird and different. In interviews, he highlights tracks like Son of the Morning Star, where his tone changes all throughout. Maybe my favorite track is Going Down to Die. It's a very mid-tempo song about coming to terms with your own mortality. It can be interpreted to be about suicide, or maybe just the coming to old age or disease. It's fucking heartbreaking, honestly. Every time Glenn wails that chorus and screams the word goodbye, I get a little teary-eyed. It's one of the few songs of this record to feature a guitar solo, and what a solo for John to leave us with. It's as emotional and gut-wrenching as the vocals and lyrics are. Both Erie and John have cited similarities between Danzig IV and Glenn's former band, Samhain, and when you hear the record and compare it to Samhain's output, you can definitely see why. These songs revel in their mood and atmosphere like many Samhain tracks would. A lot of weird sounds and reverb. There may not be any songs about any Celtic deities, but these songs encompass a similar darkness, even on tracks like Sadistical and the hidden track Invocation, which a lot of people hate, but I dig those songs. They may not be highlights, but that's not their purpose. They're weird mood pieces that explore odd soundscapes or eerie Gregorian chants less than they are songs. I can totally see stuff like this being on Unholy Passion, and Stalker's song has this creepy vibe and more. It's one of the scarier cuts Glenn has ever recorded. Lyrics are incredibly disturbing, but it's more than likely about a stalking creature less than a stalking person. But the voyeurism still makes you feel uneasy. It has this menacing crawl to it. Like whoever or whatever these lyrics are coming from is getting closer and closer. It evokes this great sense of anxiety. There's a lot of dissonance in it, like John's batshit insane solo. It just sounds so ugly and gnarly, but so fucking epic. The only unfortunate thing about this album is Glenn's Cookie Monster impressions sometimes jump scaring you. And just listening to this with the knowledge that this was the last Danzig record recorded with the original Danzig band adds to this melancholic feel to it. Yes, Danzig obviously went on to record more records, but it's different. It's like the difference between the Alice Cooper band and Alice Cooper the solo artist. You can have your preferences, but they're undeniably very different animals. By the time we get to the closing track, not counting any hidden bullshit tracks, Let It Be Captured with its wistful pianos and how the crescendo ascends, I get sad but happy that this band existed at all. It gets so dense by the end with Glenn's pain performance, the piano, the additional subtle synths, Chuck and Erie keeping the groove in check, and all those additional sound effects that I'm pretty sure is just John going apeshit. And while I know the song isn't about the band breaking up, it does kind of fit in my opinion. The original Danzig lineup was really special, like a cosmic entity, so let it be captured. Danzig IV is an uncompromising listen. It's not for everybody, but if it is for you, then it's likely you already worship this record as much as I do. It's dark, twisted, and a fucking masterpiece in every sense of the word. And that's not only Danzig IV, but the original Danzig band. Everybody left for their own reasons. Hell, Chuck left before the album even came out. He was replaced by Joey Castillo. According to Erie's book, he left because they were promises not kept. make of that as you will. Apparently he tried to rejoin, but it just didn't work out. He later played for Social D for a little bit, but besides that, he hasn't really done much of anything and has moved away from the spotlight and music, seemingly. Which kinda sucks. That guy was an unsung hero. I hope he's doing okay nowadays. John left because he was the metal guy and he always felt like a bit of an outsider and didn't like that it was Glenn's band and not Glenn's, John's, Chuck's, and Erie's band. I mean, I've read a couple of interviews from him around the time this record came out and he didn't sound very happy. Also, there's, well, I'll just leave this here. The band, Erie Vaughn, Chuck Biscuits, and I were in horrible contract negotiations. Actually, there were no negotiations. Glenn wanted it all and was slowly squeezing us out. He had all the support from the label and management. We had no one backing us. Glenn could afford to outspend us all until we cried uncle. Royalties, publishing, advances, everything. He signed his own deal without us ever knowing. Welcome to the entertainment business. And Erie was suffering from chronic back pain and became disillusioned with the band. After Chuck left and Joey joined, he said that the band lost their soul. And since John was leaving after the Danzig IV tour, and he knew this, he didn't want to stick around after losing two of his good friends. Erie said of officially quitting in his book, "I called Glenn from Jersey and I said I wasn't into it anymore. It was a hard thing to do, but what made it worse was the fact he didn't even ask me to stay. He didn't bring up the years of friendship or all the good times. He didn't thank me for the loyalty, and instead he just said, 'Call me if you need anything.'" The death of the original band is a hard pill to swallow for most, and there's a clear dividing line in the band's discography for a majority of fans. The first 4 records feels like a band. They had chemistry. From here on out, it's basically just a Glenn Danzig show, even more so than it had already been. So forgive me if I play fast and loose about the shifting lineup changes, because there is a lot of them and there isn't too much to say about majority of them. But I'll stop bitching. Just like with the Misfits, I'm here to discuss everything. And besides, this is Glenn Danzig we're talking about here. He's dealt with shifting lineups more than maybe any other frontman in history, and he not only survived, but thrived. I mean, who's to say he can't do it again? Oh no.
If anyone doesn't like something you do, like next record, for whatever reason, you always have to stay true to yourself. At least this is my viewpoint. If you're doing music, you're doing it not only to make your fans happy, but you have to make yourself as a songwriter, as a creative artist, happy. What I try to do is not lose sight of what I like about music and just go off the deep end.
Now, Danzig V, Blackacidevil, fucking sucks. Now, I'm not exactly treading new ground here. Everybody rips on this album. Glenn Danzig jumps the shark and remakes himself in the image of Trent fucking Reznor. Sure, there are subtle flourishes of industrial in Danzig IV, but it was like a light seasoning on some tracks. But this album just reminds me of this one time when I was putting salt on my food, only for the salt shaker to self-destruct while I was using it, spilling a mountain of salt all over my meal and making me look like Tony Montana. Every song has these shit generic industrial instrumentals and none of them are interesting. It just sounds like mush. Glenn even had the bright idea to distort his voice on nearly every track. Why, dude? That's your band's selling point. That's like Eddie Van Halen not playing guitar and only synthesizer. Oh wait, never mind, that actually happened. Even bringing in Jerry Cantrell to play guitar on a few tracks does not help. This everything in the kitchen sink style of industrial has never been my favorite, but if you're gonna do it, then go balls to the wall like Skinny Puppy with samples and lush soundscapes, or God forbid, actually write hooks like 9 Inch Nails. It hits this shit middle ground because this album sounds like a mess, but the songwriting itself is so basic and repetitive and just plain stupid. Take the opener of 7th House. Now, having a cringy-ass line like, "Girl, I'm gonna make you come, free your body with my gun," is bad enough and is already grounds to be made fun of. But when you repeat it over and over and over again, it not only tells me you're fucking lazy, but you're creatively spent. Not to mention, Glenn didn't really put together a new band for this album. At At least not yet. Joey Castillo was on drums, Joseph Bashara, aka the Darth Maul demon looking motherfucker from Insidious, is on keyboards and programming, and Glenn is doing everything else. Glenn's playing most of the guitar, bass, some keyboards, and he's producing it all on his lonesome. Sure, he basically produced How the Gods Kill himself too, but at least Chuck, Erie, and John and some talented engineers were there to keep Glenn in check and, rein him in. And Rick sometimes might barge in and make a sandwich, nap, and then leave, but Rick is gone too because Glenn left Deaf American. If you ask me, Glenn started believing his own hype. Oh, I don't need those other guys. I wrote those songs. They're not important. Metallica loves me. Guns N' Roses loves me. I can do no fucking wrong. But Glenn has never been a one-man show. He's been probably the most important member of every band he's ever been in, but you need seasoning for food to taste really good. Or good icing on a cake. And that's when people like Chuck Biscuits, Erie Vaughn, John Christ, Rick Rubin, hell, or even fucking Doyle came in. It's those new ideas that came into the fray which can transform a song to something transcendent. Need I remind you that the original demo of Mother was basically a Misfits song before Rick and company worked their magic? And by doing so much himself, Glenn sabotages himself. He abandons his strengths and indulges in his weaknesses. And Glenn really thought he did something here. I want to do something that nobody else is really doing. So I took an element of industrial that I liked here, an element of techno here, then mixed it with what I normally do. Glenn, I hate to break it to you, but this is the most industrial album I've ever heard. There's nothing on here that hasn't already been done before and done better. Is it all bad? No. It definitely gets better in the second half. The cover of Hand of Doom is neat. Come to Silver was originally written for Johnny Cash after he gave the Man in Black the song 13 a few years prior, and if it wasn't for the Boss Metal Zone in front of the song, I would probably love it. Jerry Cantrell even has a really cool solo. And the final track, the piano ballad, I guess, Ashes, is honestly fantastic. Glenn says it's about happy depression. The industrial elements are used like a flavor instead of the basis of the entire dish. Glenn doesn't use any distortion or effects on his voice, and thank God for that. It's understated and even reaches some cool high notes, or at least high notes for Glenn. It's not something you hear very often. It's maybe his last truly great vocal performance, honestly. Danzig V has some defenders, mainly Glenn himself. He said, and I quote, "People either loved or hated it, and we got a lot of new fans from its release. Now if you like this record, fair enough, you do you. But was anyone's jumping on points Danzig V? If you're one of those people, then by all means sound off in the comments, but I have a hard time believing these people exist." Besides that, Glenn signed to Hollywood Records, a subsidiary of the Disney Corporation, which is pretty fucking funny. Does this mean that Glenn is a Disney princess now? I hope so. But I'm done with this album. It has its moments here or there, but besides that, it sucks. God, I like 9 Inch Nails and all, but Trent Reznor has a lot to answer for. The commercialization of industrial music and its consequences has been a disaster for the gothic race.
Originally, the lineup of Danzig was never supposed to last that long with those members. And I think it lasted too long with those members. And some of the ideas I wanted to use and go with, darker, harder stuff, people like Biscuits and Erie and John just didn't want to get it.
The sixth Danzig album was of course called Danzig 666 Satan's Child, because, come on, how could he resist? He even put a colon in the title to make it look like a Bible verse. And honestly, I kind of like this album. It's not great. In fact, compared to the first 4, it's downright pitiful, but a standard industrial metal sound with more guitars fits Danzig far better than the everything in the kitchen sink approach used on Danzig V. These songs feel more fleshed out and they fit Glenn's vocals more. Yeah, about that. Danzig 6 is the first time we hear the full degradation of Glenn's vocals. They're way weaker and very wispy. The powerful bellow heard on previous records is just not here anymore. And even when he tries to scream, it just sounds like he's not quite reaching where he's trying to get. they sound anemic. So I'm kind of okay with the vocal processing on this album. Glenn's vocals aren't what they used to be, but there are also more subtle effects used here than the Boss DS1 he was singing through on like 90% of Danzig V at least. The guitars are a welcome inclusion into the sound. They make the songs sound more powerful, but there's no real riffs. Both Glenn and a guy named Jeff Chambers play guitar on this thing. One is credited as guest and the other is credited as additional guitars, so I have no idea who the main axe-slinger is on this album. The opener, Five Finger Crawl, is probably my favorite off this record. I really love how the guitars meld with the industrial sounds. It just seems a more natural way of making an industrial Danzig song. And it's good to see Glenn experimenting and making lemonade from the lemons that you could call his battered voice by using some weird harmonies and making his almost whispered vocals in the verses sound so menacing. Belly of the Beast has a lot of cool sounds and noises. This is the first Danzig album recorded digitally, and you can tell, but they utilized the technology decently well. Danzig re-recorded his own song that Johnny Cash originally sang, 13, and I know it's good and all, but Glenn wrote it for Johnny Cash, not himself. There's a really cool ballad called Cold Eternal. It has this trip-hop-esque drum pattern and these guitar licks and sound effects that throughout kind of evoke an eerie sense of nostalgia, but not a good kind of nostalgia. The kind of nostalgia you feel for times that weren't that great, to say the least. And the lyrics reflect this. It's about the ghosts of your past. Whether they're metaphorical or literal ghosts, I'll let you be the judge. And despite Glenn's weak vocals, you can still feel all the emotion, and honestly, that's probably more important than if he's always in the right key or if his voice isn't as strong.
But you know it's all it's known.
As much of an improvement I believe this record is, I kind of respect it less than Danzig V. Say what you will about it, but Danzig V was bold and a risk, and you could tell it was something he wanted to do. It didn't feel like a sellout, but after that album got the reception it did, it seems that Glenn kind of damage controlled a bit by adding more guitars and trying to make an industrial record that your standard metalhead might actually like. It feels like a safety measure. He's not sticking to his guns. He's being a little bit of a chicken. Hell, he said he tried to take elements from all the previous Danzig records, I assume to lure back old school fans, but I honestly hear very little of the band's original outputs, and that's not a bad thing. I'd rather him do something new, but he's trying to have his cake and eat it too by trying to appeal to people who've already given up on Danzig. But it isn't even that much better all in all. I'd probably give Danzig V a 3 or maybe a 4 out of 10, and this one a 6. It's better, but not enough to make us forget about the misstep of an album that came previous. The riffs are damn near non-existent, the guitars only exist to give texture, and the jump the fuck up-esque chugging just gets on my nerves. And for every time Glenn makes his diminished voice work, there's 4 more examples of it just sounding bad. Let's hope Glenn goes back to basics for the next record, because this industrial thing is not working out. Oh god fucking damn it, Glenn.
Well, there was a lot of guitar on 5, you just couldn't hear it, you know, that crazy assault. And the same thing with 6, there's a lot of guitars on 6. This is more, even further you know, I don't see it as sounding like Danzig 1, because it doesn't, because Danzig 1 is very stripped down and this is very produced. This is just very heavy. A lot of tuned down guitars, really just kind of like my answer to all the rap metal crap that's out there, or like frat metal guys stealing heavy music and trying to make it into like some kind of frat rock, and that ain't gonna happen. Not while I'm around. It ain't gonna happen.
Danzig 777 I Luciferi. Again, of course he called it that, how could he not? And like the somewhat lazy title, we have a somewhat lazy album. Again, like Satan's Child, it feels like another half measure. Well, people still didn't like the last album despite the decreased industrial sounds, so let's turn them down again, but still not completely get rid of them. Shit, or get off the pot, Glenn. It sounds like a decision made in the mixing. The song structures sound like they were written to have the same overwhelming production of Danzig VI, but after the recording sessions, they decided to get rid of most of the sounds they would have used, leaving us with an album that feels unsure of what it's supposed to be. We go from the usual jump the fuck up riffs to what sounds like Jimi Hendrix and or Zeppelin worship. Luciferi can't decide if it wants to be a return to roots or another industrial metal experiment. And it doesn't help that this album is boring too, despite the two hugely contrasting directions that Glenn chose at once. This album is so monotonous and nearly every track just congeals into an industrial metal mush. Mush is an apt word to use because it sounds like ass, compressed in moon and back, and Glenn's vocals are super quiet. Then again, given how his voice was aging, that may have been a good decision. And when tracks stand out, it's not for the right reasons. Kiss the Skull's riff is a pretty blatant ripoff of Marilyn Manson's Beautiful People. And he wasn't even the first shock rocker to rip off that riff during an industrial period. Only difference is, Alice Cooper's Cold Machines is a fucking banger. I think Alice took the riff and made a song that destroys Manson's, but Danzig's song sounds like a Static X B-side. Best track, I guess, is the last one, Without Loud AM. Classic Danzig song structure, going from loud, quiet, but it actually gets interesting near the end when we get some extra sounds, and it sounds like a mix between actual Danzig and something from the Black Aria. It gives the song a really cool scope and grand feel. It's so brick-walled I honestly have a hard time being able to tell what exactly it is, though I guess it's some sort of MIDI strings or something, but, you know, it sounds cool. It sounds like Glenn actually committing to something. Too bad it takes until the final 2 minutes of this album for it to finally get interesting. Danzig 777 I Luciferi is just bleh. It's not outright bad, but it's the most mid of all of his records. There's some neat moments here or there, but not enough to justify listening to the slog. At least Danzig V was more interesting and it had some highlights. I honestly like songs like Come to Silver or Ashes and Hand of Doom way more than maybe any of these songs. Granted, the misses were also far worse than anything here, but I'd rather you take big swings, cause sure you might strike out, but at least you'll occasionally hit a home run. But I Luciferi is Glenn purposely getting hit in the face with a baseball to limp to first base. Maybe if you have more of a palate for this kind of metal, then you get something more out of it. But if I were you, I'll just listen to Alice Cooper's Brutal Planet. It's better than these past 3 records combined. Well, I can't take much more of this, man.
I heard that you have a skeleton of a 2-headed baby, is that true?
Yeah.
That's insane. Can I check out your book collection?
Yeah, you want to go in the library, right? And I built this library just because I thought it would house all my books, and I was wrong.
I have books.
I have boxes of books that I still can't put up, so I have to build another library. Lucifer, the devil, Satan, black arts, magic, vampires, werewolves, voodoo. I ran out of space for all my voodoo books.
Sorry folks, despite getting exactly what I asked for, we have another kind of mid-album. Again, it's not awful. In fact, I do think it's better than 777. Rest in peace to the numbered albums though. Circle of Snakes is Glenn finally going back to basics, and thank God for that. The industrial era was quaint at best and an unmitigated disaster at worst. But Circle of Snakes has a hard time justifying its existence beyond a back-to-basics hard rock heavy metal Danzig album. It feels quite unspecial. Sure, the debut was very bare bones too, but Glenn also had the original lineup, and Rick Rubin backing him up. Not to mention, Glenn's voice ain't even close to his peak here like on the debut. It's better than the last few records, I'll give him that. Doesn't sound like he's whispering every line. Maybe he bought himself some chamomile tea. Tommy Victor, or Prong, officially joined the band for this album. He previously toured with Danzig a bit, but this is the first time on record, and I like him in Danzig. Sure, he's not John Christ, but not even Christ is John Christ, so I won't hold that against him. His riffs are pretty tasty, though he can go a bit ham on the pinch harmonic sometimes, but it could be worse. All I know, that's probably Glenn's doing. He can play in a similar style to our Lord and Savior, but he has his own style of play that can be heard on the epic closer, Black Angel, White Angel. He plays in a thrashy kind of way with a lot of down-picked, palm-muted chugging to build tension and race to crescendo. John didn't do much, if any, kind of stuff like this. The lyrics refer to Cain and Abel. I think I'm having flashbacks, but no, it isn't a retread of Twist of Cain. This song is its own thing, but the biblical imagery also has parallels to things like war, and with the elevated feel of the track, I feel that's what Glenn is getting at. By far the best song off the record. Highly recommend it. Besides that, I love the cool doom metal of When We Were Dead and Netherbound. Skullforce has a cool, creepy vibe, even if the vocals are way too quiet in the chorus. And A Thousand Devils Reign is classic, catchy Danzig. But besides that, I have a hard time thinking of reasons to come back to this album. A lot of it is really forgettable outside those songs mentioned. After this record, Johnny Kelly from Typo Negative joined the band on drums, and Steve Zing, formerly the drummer of Glenn's pre-Danzig band Samhain, joined on bass. I finally talk about the lineup here because, for the most part since the mid-2000s, this has been the lineup of Danzig, though Steve doesn't play at all on the records, which I think is a little lame. After this record, there's a sequel to the Black Aria, Black Aria II. The first one was inspired by Paradise Lost, but this one was inspired by the mythological figure of Lilith, whom I have already talked about in this video. It's pretty good, a bit more ambient this time around, but it sells the atmosphere. Though I do prefer the first Black Aria, I can't lie here. There's a Lost Tracks of Danzig compilation made up of songs that never made it onto any proper records for one reason or another. Also, this happened. And finally, a whole 6 later, after Circle of Snakes, Danzig released Deth Red Sabaoth.
When I'm doing a record, I always make sure that I keep in mind who I am and what I'm about and what it is I do. And so it's just second nature. I already know. Right away when I write something, if it's not remotely Danzig, it's out the door. It doesn't even make it to the studio. So I guess I'm known for writing catchy, heavy songs, and I really wanted this one to even be more like early 70s record with a very contemporary feel though.
People like to poo-poo all of Glenn's output since Danzig IV, myself included, but goddamn, Deth Red Sabaoth is something I feel he can rightly at least compare to the glory days of Danzig. It doesn't feel like a continuation of those records, but more like an amalgamation. It's just about everything you would want from a Danzig record released in modern day. Kind of. It's got the atmosphere, evil riffs, groovy drums, and Glenn's voice is greatly improved from the last few albums. His voice sounds like the one we fell in love with for the first time since the 90s. It's honestly really impressive he got his voice into such great shape. Glenn said he wants to go for a more organic sound as opposed to the clusterfuck industrial period or Circle of Snakes slightly cynical sound, and that sound comes through. There's more analog effects and a looser vibe. It's a breath of fresh air, let me tell ya. From the first track, Hammer of the Gods, a song about the Battle of Ragnarok in Norse mythology, it's anthemic with catchy riffs while keeping the heightened spectacle a song about a legendary battle should have. Add in a tasty doom section and I'm a happy camper. The lead single, On a Wicked Night, was an instant Danzig classic the minute it was released. Very Danzig II inspired. It takes a lot of old Delta blues influence with Glenn and Tommy's clean guitar strumming, cowboy chords, but it keeps his spirits even when the rest of the band comes in. It's about a man's last moments as Lady Death comes to claim him, but there's a history of sorts between the narrator and Lady Death herself, but it's never said explicitly what it is, which I really appreciate. I like to think they're real lovers, but not necessarily in their current lives. Very spooky and sensual. much as I like the record and its sound, I feel it goes a little too into lo-fi at times. We're definitely seeing the pitfalls as Danzig as a producer. He has great ideas, but isn't great at realizing them sonically, at least not anymore. Glenn talked about using these 70s bass amps for the guitars, and that's probably why they sound so undefined and mushy. On a lot of tracks you hear crackling like something is malfunctioning. I, for one, do not like getting paranoid that my fucking headphones are dying while listening, Glenn. And also, Glenn's vocals can get really quiet at times. I know I'm sounding like I'm looking a gift horse in the mouth here, but just keep Glenn away from the mixing desk. That's all I ask for, dude. On a more positive note, the best tracks are Black Candy, including drums from Glenn himself, since Johnny Kelly couldn't make it to the studio, and he hasn't lost a step since November Coming Fire. The Pyre of Souls epic is fantastic, but my favorite track is the near title track, Deth Red Moon. This song is a great 70s classic rock thing going on. I love the big open chords and the additional percussion, the absolute earworm of a chorus. The lyrics I feel are about the apocalypse. Keep in mind this is 2010 and people were talking about the end of the world in 2012 with the Mayan calendar and all that, but Glenn had been around the block a few times and he knew this sort of thing was nothing new. And in this song, the narrator is staring down at this floating ball in space and its continual deterioration and decay. There's almost a serenity to it. Deth Red Sabaoth is a good Danzig record. If you gave up on Big D after Danzig IV, then give this one a shot, but it's not the first 4 records at all. Sure, compared to everything else since, it's a goddamn masterpiece, but that might be part of the problem with how people view this album sometimes. If you're dying of thirst, then sure, a room temperature glass of water will do the trick, but it's far from the best out there. Even some of the positives have their drawbacks. Glenn's voice is much better, but he sometimes sings distractingly off key, and the production is cool and vintage, but much of the time it sounds vintage in the worst ways possible. It's no monotheist or anything, so don't expect the world, but maybe that's okay. Maybe Glenn just needs to find his bearings so he can record a new— Oh, you've got to be fucking kidding me!
Recently you just posted this photo of you in the skull makeup, and you said that you haven't done that since 79 or 80.
Yeah, it was the idea for this covers record. The makeup came later. I had titled it Skeletons before, kind of like skeletons in your closet or old songs, pulling them out. So I just did it. I got out the acrylic paint and started doing my thing.
Now, Skeletons is pretty fucking awful, but I almost like it. Maybe this is the sheep in me, but I can see the record Glenn was trying to make. A garagey covers record of some classic tracks and weird oddities that made him the artist that he is. The main problem, or one of the main problems, is the format. The thing is with covers albums, at best they're just kinda neat, and at worst it feels like you just saw the face of God and it was weeping. And Skeletons definitely falls near the latter end of the spectrum. It's just a mess. Thoroughly disjointed, badly mixed, for the most part badly performed, and just a general bad idea, I guess. You might be wondering how it's disjointed. It has a consistent theme, sure, but these are supposed to be songs that informed Glenn as an artist in some way. So why the fuck is he covering ZZ Top's Rough Boy? Don't get me wrong, it's a good song, but really? We have maybe the worst cover of NIB I've ever heard, which makes no sense. Glenn covering Sabbath is almost too obvious, if anything. How did you fuck this up? To then getting a cover of the Trogs, A Girl Like You, with Glenn really committing to the bit with these vocals. There's so much tonal and auditory dissonance. It sucks in ways too obvious to even point out. Glenn said there's no purpose in covering songs note for note, and that any good cover should distinguish itself, and I agree with that. And none of these covers really sound like the originals. Mainly because the original song sounded good. But how do I almost like it, you may ask? When this record is at its most listenable, it's when you can tell Glenn is just having fun giving a stamp on these songs, like a little kid learning his first chords and cutting his teeth learning his favorite songs. The cover of the theme from Devil's Angels is an arrangement Glenn has had since the 70s, and it sounds like it. It kinda sounds like the Misfits, and you can tell it means a lot to him to finally record it. The enthusiasm is really infectious. Let Your Stuff Go is a better Elvis cover than anything from a certain other covers record. By giving it a cool chuggy guitar, it feels more in Glenn's wheelhouse while still feeling old school. It's not as good as the Trouble cover is, but it's still kind of cool. I honestly don't mind his covers of Rough Boy and Aerosmith's Lord of the Thighs, though the original songs, being as good as they are, probably do a lot of the legwork. And I really dig the cover of Crying in the Rain. I like how it gave it this Phil Spector-esque arrangement with the drums and backing vocals that sound heavenly. Sure, there's also a really shitty scratch guitar in there, but I can live with it. And you can tell this is a song that means a lot to Glenn. He sings the lyrics with such reverence and respect to the Everly Brothers. I'm not kidding, it's legitimately really good. But this record is still pretty goddamn terrible. I'm not saying Skeletons is some overlooked and unfairly hated gem. The thrashing this record received is very much deserved. I just can't hate at least a handful of the tracks. And it probably had at least some potential. Approach with caution, that's all I'll say. If there's one thing these videos have taught me, it's that covers records are rarely a good idea. Any bands listening who are thinking of recording a covers record, just say no.
No, I remember even as a little kid in kindergarten, everyone else would be drawing boats and stuff, and I would be drawing monsters and dinosaurs eating people. And the teacher would be like, "Why are you drawing this?" And I was like, when I'm drawing, he told me to draw. It's like, well, can't you draw a nice little snow mountain or a hill or this? I was like, nope. Can't do it.
Keep your hands on a wheel, make those tires peel if you're gonna make us run alive. Devil on Highway 9. Devil on Highway 9.
I remember when Black Laden Crown initially came out, I was totally blindsided. I never saw anything about it until I saw reviews for it the day of release. Which is weird because I was already very aware of Danzig by this point, and I was already aware of Skeletons coming out 2 years previous, so I didn't know what happened here. I then used less than legal avenues to get my hands on the album, and I had a real negative reaction to it. I got maybe only halfway into it before just giving up and labeling it a dud. In fact, since this record got scrubbed from streaming, I haven't given it another chance until the scripting process of this video. So 7 years later, does this album still suck in my eyes? Yeah, kinda. A lot of this record keeps to the doomy side of Danzig, which I usually love, but on this record, the riffs just aren't good enough to justify the slow pace of the songs. So many of them drag. The arrangements too. The title track has this tempo shift that is so abrupt and abrasive. I thought I accidentally skipped a track or something, but no, that's how it's supposed to sound. The original band could probably make a shift like this flow very well, or if Tommy Victor was allowed to, I'm sure he could do something, but Glenn can't have that, can he? And it's not helped by Glenn's voice, which unfortunately is more withered than ever. You barely get any of his signature howls and yells. His voice is just simply not able to be pushed like that anymore. His voice also kind of differs from song to song. On But a Nightmare, his vocals sound honestly pretty good.
I am just a specter floating right above your face.
But on other tracks, it's nothing but a whisper.
Blackness drips into your eyes.
Maybe he just decided to record most of his vocals right after a tour or something, I don't know. Or maybe during the 3 years in which his album was recorded, his voice just withered over time. And the motherfucking sound is abysmal. If there's an actual bass guitar, I can't hear it. All I can hear is a sub-bass fuzz. The drums may as well not exist, the guitar tone can be ear-piercingly spiky, and Glenn's voice is front and center, warts and all. Occasionally you get a little reverb, but that's it. That poor mixing desk needs to file a restraining order against Glenn, I swear. His voice is either too loud or too quiet, it's just... But it's not all bad. Tommy Victor does a commendable job, all things considered. Joey Castillo comes back for a couple of songs, and he crushes it along with Johnny Kelly, Dark Verbron, and Carl Roskist, I believe is pronounced. And Glenn himself is even on the skins. As good as all these guys do, this record did not need 5 drummers. I like the energetic Devil on Highway 9, it's got some really tasty licks from Tommy, has a great sinister chug to it, feels like you're on a nice Harley Davidson speeding down a Nevada desert. And Last Ride is a more laid-back rocker, which Glenn apparently wrote for the Walking Dead series, but that never came to fruition. And it's a fantastic song that feels more about Glenn at this stage of his career than fucking zombies, despite the clipping audio. Glenn sounds pretty alright on this track, and it feels conclusive. I don't know if Glenn will ever make another record of original material. He might, but it's been 7 years since his album came out, and Glenn is in his 70s now, so it's kind of unlikely, but if not, a song like Last Ride fits his last ride. So that's Black Laden Crown. I know I just bitched a good bit, but it's not too terrible, I guess. I just probably have too high standards. But if you don't care about production too much, and you can forgive Glenn's depreciating vocals, you can probably get some fun out of this one. And for a final proper studio Danzig record, it could have been much worse. Speaking of worse...
Why do you feel such an affinity towards male vocalists? I mean, like really classic male vocalists like Roy Orbison and Elvis.
Because they could sing.
Yeah. Is that how you'd like to be remembered, as like a classic male vocalist?
Well, that wouldn't be bad. It's kind of a drag always being compared to dead people.
Come on back to me, little girl, so we can play some house. Now, baby, come back, baby girl. Come back, baby girl. Come back, baby, I want to play house. Let's play some house.
I am sad. Let me tell you something. April of 2020 got even more depressing for me when this album was released, I'll say that much. Glenn had been talking about doing an Elvis covers record for years, and I always thought it was a fucking bad idea. Now, of course, at a time, it was almost too obvious not to. People have been calling Glenn Evil Elvis since the 70s, and Eerie Von tried to get Glenn to do an Elvis tribute in the 90s, but the time for it came and went. Glenn simply does not have the prowess anymore to do the king any justice. He recorded Trouble a couple times, and that was great, but that was decades ago. Say what you want about Elvis, even at his fattest, that fucker could always sing. But Glenn... Christ. Those old Elvis records weren't exactly known for their heavy riffs and crushing drums, so this record is going to live and die by the strength of Glenn's voice, and this is just pitiful, dude. A little reverb ain't enough to hide that fact, Glenn, I'm sorry. It's the equivalent of shooting Homer's makeup gun at a rotting corpse. The arrangements are also shit. Of course the production blows, but of course it does. Outside of Joey Castillo playing on one song and Tommy Victor, Glenn is playing everything. And just because you can, it doesn't mean you should. The performances sound like free tracks you find on YouTube. They're just lesser attempts at the original. The only real noticeable difference is the fact that there's far too much gain on the guitars. Which is funny, because during the press for Skeletons, Glenn was saying how if you're gonna cover a song, you should put your own spin on it.
My attitude with covers is you gotta bring a new element.
Sure.
Or a new dimension to it and kind of make it your own.
But outside a few weird things here or there, he's not trying to do anything new here. At least with Let Yourself Go from Skeletons, Glenn heavied up the song a good bit. Sure, it ain't much, but it's something. The only times he tried something really different was with Always on My Mind, but he removed the backing vocals in the chorus.
You were always on my mind. You were always on my mind. You were always on my mind. You were always on my mind.
That's like half the hook. On Is It So Strange is this really shitty and distracting guitar track that I swear was just a scratch track before they added piano that they forgot to remove. Baby Let's Play House has this super distracting distorted guitar. I mean, it never ends. Honestly, I'm not a huge Elvis guy. Mainly because I'm not fucking 80. Honestly, I don't listen to very much pre-60s music, so I went back and listened to the original Elvis songs that Glenn covered here, and it made me wonder if the Danzig Elvis comparisons are only superficial. Sure, Glenn can sound like him. Well, I used to be able to. But his overall vibe and sense of charisma is totally different. A big part of what made Elvis the superstar he was his entire being. Not just his voice, but how he used his voice. He played with the words and he didn't sing like anybody else who wasn't black. It may not sound like much, but when you hear Glenn attempt these songs, especially in the more up-tempo numbers, you realize there's more differences than similarities. Sure, he was influenced by Elvis, but he was also influenced by Lou Reed. He doesn't sound like him. There's nothing much else to say. Danzig Sings Elvis is just a worthless fart of a record. Even Danzig V had some highlights. I Luciferi was mid, but passable. Even Skeletons had some guilty pleasures for me, but there's just nothing redeemable here. It's a waste of time, a waste of money, a waste of effort, a waste in general. Not worth the time of fans of Danzig, Elvis, music. What should have been a slam dunk is more like a wet fart. Just a sad album that never fails to sour my mood. It's not so bad it's good, it's so bad it's depressing. That was a nice way to end this video, I guess. And that was not only Danzig, but Glenn Danzig. I've listened to and reviewed every record that he's ever done. There's some things I kind of neglected, like the live album, some compilations, and some songs here or there, but I got mostly everything. Hell, I didn't even get a chance to talk about the time he guested on an album by Melissa Off Damar with a song called Father's Grave, which is honestly really fucking good. Seriously, check that out if you haven't heard it. I honestly wanted to avoid Danzig for a retrospective because I knew there's a certain point where it would just get kind of sad, but I'm glad I finally put in the effort for the man who's made so much music which has meant the world to me. I'm not lying, this guy kind of changed the trajectory of my fucking life. I first started diving into punk rock because of the Misfits, I got further into metal because of Danzig, and I became a fucking Satanist because of Samhain. That was a joke for the record. I shouldn't have to say that, but you know how people are. In terms of general influence, I'm not sure if there's another artist who has influenced me more than Glenn Danzig in music and life in general. He's always marched to the beat of his own drum, never changing to suit the zeitgeist. The zeitgeist changed to suit him. A visionary, a renaissance man, and an artist in the truest sense of the word. Sure, he's easy to make fun of. God knows he's easy to make fun of. And sure, he seems to have developed some brain worms in later years, but I'm more than willing to give him a pass when I listen to records like Lucifuge, or Danzig IV, or November Coming Fire, or Walk Among Us, or Static Age. And of course, we can't forget about the people like Jerry Only, Doyle, Eerie Vaughn, John Christ, Chuck Biscuits, Rick Rubin, I can go on. Those guys also deserve their fair share of praise for the mark they left on their respective eras of Glenn's music. So this one's for you, Glenn. You've changed my life in more ways than you'll ever know. And the mark you left on punk rock in general, metal, etc. is simply untouchable. Even if you're only about 3'2", you're a true giant that will never be forgotten. Take it easy, party people.
My name is Vince, by the way.
I am Radu.
Radu, it's great to meet you.
My friend, you need a beach outfit.
I just don't know what someone of my look wears here.
But the beach, it has its own expression, its own style. I have been collecting all these years. Let me share with you what I have found. Are you familiar with Billy Bong?
Subscribe. Yeah, but